Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And if you read the newspapers, you know that one of the biggest issues, one of the biggest socioeconomic issues coming out of the recent financial meltdown is the problem of home foreclosures. Tonight we'll be talking about that with two members of a respected nonprofit group here in Chicago, the Chicago Legal Clinic. We have Executive Director Ed Grossman and Staff Attorney Chris Haddad. Chris, Ed, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Ed, let's start with you. Even though the Chicago Legal Clinic has been around for decades, there are probably people who don't know who you are or what you do. So let's talk a little bit about the clinic and what it does and how it came into being.
I'm a classmate of Bishop Tom Poprocki, who is currently the Bishop of the Diocese of Springfield, Illinois. But when we were classmates at DePaul College of Law back in the late 1970s, he was assigned to a parish in South Chicago. South Chicago at that time was a hub of the steel industry in this country, not so much anymore. When I first came to South Chicago in 1978, there were approximately 20,000 people working at what was then U.S. Steel. By the time I graduated, it was no longer U.S. Steel, it was USX, and there were about 900 people working there. So the neighborhood was in substantial turmoil because of the collapse in the steel industry. And not just that company, but many other companies. There was something like 45% unemployment in the community. Tom wanted to do something about that and asked me if I would work with him to establish legal services for people in the community who were devastated by the collapse of the steel industry.
But now, a clinic like that, helping people who have lost their jobs, lost their homes, they don't have a lot of money to pay lawyers, and legal fees can be very high. So I'm sure that the clinic is not funded by legal fees coming from the people you represent. How do you stay afloat?
We do actually receive some fees on some of our programs, but the clinic has 15 distinct programs which provide service to people, and 13 of them are not fee-based programs. So we have an awful lot of pro bono legal work that we do. The programs include a domestic violence program, which is free to victims of domestic violence. We have a pro bono program whereby we try and get law firms and lawyers from around the Chicago area to take cases for meritorious cases from clients who qualify for free legal services. We have an environmental law program which provides urban environmental services. We don't save the rainforest or the whales.
But there's plenty of
many in
environmental
Chicago.
opportunities in the Chicago
Right.
area.
There is lead in public housing and
Bubbly Creek.
right. But so we do that, and we also have a program for seniors and people with disabilities who are having debt issues. We have an immigration program, and we have the programs evolved over the years so that the clinic now, as we sit here, has offices, full-time offices in South Chicago, the Austin community, the Pilsen community, our downtown office at 211 West Wacker, and then we also run a number of programs for the Circuit Court of Cook County, and we have what we call a Circuit Writer program where we send attorneys to neighborhoods that don't otherwise have a full-time provider of legal services. We also have an ex-offender advocacy program that runs out of our Austin office where we help people who have had a conviction for a relatively minor offense, but now it's preventing them from getting employment or housing, and we're trying to remove that barrier so they can become productive members of society.
But you don't do any kind of criminal law, so that it's
we don't do
distinct
criminal
from a public
defense.
defender or
Right. This is a civil legal service that we provide. And so the clinic now serves close to 40,000 people a year, the vast majority of which I assume we'll be talking about tonight are people caught up in the foreclosure mess.
Which brings us to our topic of tonight, the foreclosures. So, Chris, let's talk to you for a moment about foreclosures. Now, I think anyone who pays attention to the news knows that this is a major problem. But how big is it in the Chicago area or in the Cook County? Are we better, worse than the national average? What's happening here?
Well, we are not, Illinois in general is not, it's not one of the top 5, I believe, in the nation at this point in time, but as far as Illinois is concerned, Cook County has one of the more dense populations, so of course it's got more foreclosures going on.
So in the case of a foreclosure, there's a lot of things going on in foreclosures, right? So if you're about to lose your home, there's lots of different ways, lots of different areas where that affects your life, financial, emotional, societal. So if someone comes to you, well, first of all, how do they find you and know that you're available in order to help them out?
Well, there is The program has a main number that starts with the housing counselors, actually, and that phone number is mailed out in the summons, which goes out on every complaint and is supposed to be served personally or at least by substitute service to each individual. Sometimes they're served by publication, but that's a sidetrack.
So the letters, the summons that actually goes out to the homeowner themselves has your phone number in it.
Yeah, it's on the second page generally. They have English and Spanish.
How did you manage to swing that they would? Because you're not associated with the government, right, or with the banks, or nor with the courts.
Sort of with the courts on this one, anyhow. The clinic is an independent entity. We're a separate 501c3 organization. However, the genesis of this particular program in the desk started about 7.5 years ago. We established a foreclosure at Chancery, actually, which is the division of the court where foreclosures are heard. We established an advice desk to assist pro se litigants, that is, litigants without an attorney, because at the time the judges felt that there was a huge influx of such litigants in the division. Well, that was when there were maybe 8,000 or 10,000 foreclosures filed in Cook County, and that was, as I say, in 2003. And this year there will be something over 50,000 foreclosures filed in Cook County.
From
So
8,000 to 50,000.
something, don't put me in statistics jail if I'm not
that-
exactly right, but it's something like that.
It's that
It's over
magnitude, right?
50,000, and there are over 60,000, maybe close to 70,000 cases pending, because not every case is resolved in the same year. So there's a tsunami of foreclosures. That's how bad it is. However, the court was looking, and particularly Judge Kennard, the former chief judge of the division, and Tim Evans, who's the chief judge of all of Cook County, we're looking at ways to provide a more comprehensive array of services to address the foreclosure crisis, and particularly to help those who were involved with owner-occupied residential properties as opposed to some commercial property. And so they decided to put together an array of services that includes housing counselors, which Chris alluded to, and then legal services. And if the housing counselors can't get a loan modification or otherwise get the people in a better position, then they get sent to the lawyers who look at each client to determine whether or not there might be a procedural or substantive defense to the foreclosure. If we can't avail them, we send them to mediation services, and the mediation hopefully negotiates either some favorable disposition for them, or in many cases they get to keep their house.
Well, so, Chris, when someone comes to you and finds out about you and calls on the phone and they're distraught, what's the process? How do you first approach them?
Well, ideally they should see the housing counselor first, because this individual will evaluate their financial situation.
The
and
housing
see-
counselor, someone on your staff, right?
Yeah, well, no.
That's-
Illinois Housing Development Authority, IDA, it's a consortium of groups that work for them that the court has contracted with to provide the housing counseling services. We're the cream filling in the Oreo cookie of housing counseling and mediation. We're the legal services.
Do they agree with that? Is that
I don't know if
something
that's how
you've
they
all-
describe it. That's what
pretty
I say.
accurate.
Okay, all
Yeah.
right.
So after they've seen the housing counselor and we have some idea of what situation they're in with that, they come see us and we help them with their initial paperwork, their appearance and answer, which are required when you want to participate in a court case. And we help to give them direction. If we find a defense, then we help to refer them to an attorney who can handle the defense more substantively than we can.
Now, would that be an attorney on your staff or a private
Generally,
practice
that's with the
attorney?
Chicago Volunteer Legal Services, their Access to Justice program. So we have a special motion that we can fill out for them to get access to justice.
So what would be a possible defense?
If there was some kind of fraud in the formation of the contract, if payments were being made and were lost, for example, which is
I
sometimes...
read is actually common.
Well, it
or
happens a lot
not
of times
uncommon.
when the servicer changes. A payment or two will get lost, and usually the banks are able to resolve that, but once in a while they'll end up in foreclosure when, and it usually will start where the bank will start sending back the payments because you're deficient, they assume you're deficient even though this payment just got lost.
Now, that's an interesting concept because the banks can send back payments. If they decide that you're in arrears too deeply,
Yes.
even though you're making payments, they'll send them back.
Yep.
Now, most people would think that's ridiculous. I'm doing my best to try to help this situation out, and they're just sending my money back. But that's not a legal defense, is it?
No, because legally they can't be collecting your money if you're in foreclosure. If they're collecting your money, there's some kind of agreement going on, and while that might not end a case on the spot, it means that they should not be proceeding against the individual.
So when they send your money back, that's a bad sign, so to speak. Going forward from that, if you find a legal defense, and in fact, it makes me think of one of the articles that I've seen, there are many, as you know, on this subject, is about produce the note, which means the servicer needs to show that they actually hold the note to the house and are entitled to collect those payments.
Yes.
Now, the newspapers would make this out to be a fairly widespread problem. Have you seen that?
I see that somewhat frequently because the note is not required when the bank files a complaint or when the plaintiff files a complaint. The note is not required at that point in time, or rather, proper showing of the note is required, but a proper showing of ownership is not required at that time.
And that's just at the
note is
initial
a
stages,
physical,
right?
Yeah, the
Right.
note is a physical document. It's the promise to repay. And the plaintiff has to prove that it owns the promise to repay from the individual. Otherwise, why is it suing this individual?
It has no grounds
Exactly.
to sue, right?
But it doesn't have to prove that at the very beginning of the case. It has to prove that eventually. So usually when we see that come across, we just make a note of it on the answer and say, well, this particular plaintiff has not shown any of the several ways that they can show ownership. They haven't endorsed the note. They haven't attached an allonge or an assignment. They haven't recorded anything with the Cook County Recorder of Deeds.
So this is something you would investigate right at the beginning of taking on this case,
To
right?
some degree. I can only investigate it to a minimal degree because we're trying to help as many people as possible, which means that we don't have hours and hours to dedicate to investigation.
One thing I would add is, and it's fundamental not only to this program that we run, but to several other programs, people often don't bring in all the paperwork that would enable us to make an intelligent decision about what their proper course of action is. So either that requires a second visit, or we tell them, well, you can go look for that and see, and if you find that, then maybe you can
That
do
makes
something different. But we're a little hamstrung in that regard because people don't know what they ought to bring when they come to see an attorney.
Do you find that the lenders are cooperative? When you're looking at these cases, are you able to get what you need from them?
I don't want to badmouth the lenders. I'd say this, but one of the things that is
I think you just did bad.
it was a shameless bad-mouthing of the lenders. One of the things reasons why mediation is successful, and I do believe it's very successful in the program, even though not so many cases have made their way through the program to the mediation point. We started this program really in April of 2010, so it takes a while for cases to wind their way through the program. But the ones that have gone to mediation, something over 2/3 of them have resulted in an agreement, and something over half of them have resulted in situations where the people can remain in their home. And I think the reason is because of what you've just asked, communication. It's really a time when the parties sit face to face, discuss the issues, and can figure out what makes the best sense. Oftentimes, a lender is a very large institution, and maybe the borrower has tried to contact them several times, and the lender says, send us these documents. Then the documents get sent, and maybe they're lost, or maybe the people didn't send all the documents, and the lender doesn't chase them, say, you're still missing this. They might, but more often than not, the people don't know, and then they're following up, and it just really doesn't go anywhere, and then they send it to an attorney, and then the attorney is not always, they have many, many cases, the lender counsel, and it's not always a free-flowing communication, to say the least, between them and the litigant. So really the mediation component of this is a very, very
talk
good
for a
thing.
minute about mediation. I think many people probably don't understand what the difference would be between litigation and mediation, or arbitration for that matter, which generally doesn't, I imagine, enter into this. But these are legal terms that I think most people don't understand, and if you're faced with a foreclosure, what does it mean to go to a mediator?
Well, let me differentiate litigation from mediation, then I'll help to define the parameters of mediation. But litigation is a court-supervised process where one side is complaining of another about some lack of performance typically, or some money owed, and they file papers with the court. The papers can be responded to or answered to, and the answer frames the issue, and a judge decides, a judge and or a jury, but not in chancery, there's no jury, but judge typically decides the issue. That's litigation, and there are lots and lots of rules about litigation. There are rules of evidence, there are rules of what's called discovery, which is the fact-finding process, and those rules lend a tremendous amount of formality to the process. Mediation is typically conducted by a person who is specifically trained to try and facilitate agreement between the parties.
So they're looking for agreement.
They're looking to
looking for
forge
each
an
side
agreement.
to kind of compromise
That's
and come
right.
to the table.
A judge is looking to
gonna
follow
rule.
the law
Right.
and looking to follow what evidence is presented to him or her, whereas a mediator is looking to see if there's not some common ground that the parties can arrive at to forge a solution to the problem. So mediation is really not that litigation isn't looking for a solution. Certainly the lenders, by bringing a foreclosure, are looking for a solution. Usually the defendant's not voluntarily participating in
Right.
that so much so that they've got served with something. Oh, now I'm being served. So the mediation is really, it's a different frame of mind, a different process in terms of the formality of it. Cook County has based its model, it's called the Foreclosure Mediation Program, but it comprises the housing counseling and the legal services, as I said. But it's really a situation where once the people go through certain steps, mediation is available to them if they seek to participate. And that's really just a great opportunity for people to have a chance to find a solution.
So why isn't that more common? What we read about is the foreclosure crisis where people walk away. It seems as though people are at a dead end, but mediation sounds like it's a very successful alternative. Well, Chris, I mean, when you're talking with people, what do they know about this? What do they say if you tell them?
A lot of people don't understand it, and what makes Cook County's program so unique is the judges are on board with granting these mediations. It somewhat forces the bank to sit down and at least negotiate. Now, nobody can force the bank to make an agreement or the plaintiff to make an agreement, but this at least forces them to sit down and spend an hour trying.
And I think Ed said that more than half of the cases that go to mediation end up with something good for the homeowner. I mean, like they end up staying in their
and
house.
a lot of
right?
times it's a matter of getting everybody getting their ducks in a row at the same time. You have the client who has been working with the housing counselor and has been able to discover what paperwork they need, and hopefully the housing counselor continues to work with them on that. You have the bank that's starting to prepare specifically for this meeting, and you have the attorneys there to protect the interests of the clients and the mediator there to facilitate the whole thing.
It sounds like a very time-consuming process. So the person who's going through foreclosure, this has to become their primary priority, right? Well, they have to keep working and do all that stuff to pay the bills.
Priority would be to keep the income that would allow them to modify the loan or to give themselves a better chance at having a good outcome from this case. But it does take a lot of time, but it's a lot of time spread over a few months.
Now, one of the things that you mentioned before the show was the emotional toll that this takes on people. So how does that play into all of these factors, like getting them into mediation or if they end up just going to court? How do you, and particularly you as one of the staff attorneys, how do you work with that emotional, personal side of it?
Well, you have to make sure that you take time, because when somebody is in an emotional state that is not conducive to listening, then it can be difficult for people, because first of all, they're in a completely alien environment and an intimidating one, because this is the law, and I'm sure that they've heard from TV enough to frighten most people, and then it's threatening their home as well, which is a very sacred thing to a lot of people. I mean, it's their home. It's not just a building necessarily, it's a home, at least for our clients, because it must be their primary residence to get into the program.
So yeah, because you don't do commercials or rentals or anything.
Yeah, so you have to remember to take time and to look at the individuals as a whole, because this is not a happy situation for people. It's very difficult. So not
Is
only
that a required part? I mean, if you don't do that, are you less likely to have success with the client?
Well, all the attorneys in the office have their own style, and who's to say that one is better than another?
Well, I would think that could be measured with outcomes, couldn't it?
Yeah, but I personally, I think it's good to kind of vent a little at the beginning and get it out of your system. How are you doing? I know this has been a difficult process for you. How's this been going with the housing counselor? Are you comfortable with what we're going through so far? And as you're explaining it, you have to stop and say, are you comfortable with this? This is your answer to the complaint. Are you comfortable with what I've told you? Are you comfortable with what we've got down here on the paper? And if you take time to ask, I think people relax a little more and are able to focus a little better, because this is an alien process for them. So it's very difficult to go through an alien process when you're stressed out.
Any time, but especially when you're stressed.
Our attorneys are trying to elicit a tremendous amount of information in a very brief time. If the person is not relaxed and they're kind of maybe combative, scared, and you haven't gained their trust and you're not composed, it's not conducive to them transmitting that information to you.
So you have to convince them that you are their advocate.
You're on their side.
Yeah. Now, one of the questions that comes up, and I'm sure you've heard it, is that why should we be so concerned about foreclosures. Isn't this a way to flush the system of all that bad debt? And isn't it true that the economy will only improve after we get all this stuff flushed out of the system? People should never have taken these loans. They were over their head. They should have known better. They have to take responsibilities for their actions. So why do this? What is there a societal benefit, or should people just pay the consequences of their own individual actions?
Well, it would definitely be simplistic to say that there's one cause for this, one solution, or that if something happens, it's all good or it's all bad. The reality is there are certain people who probably didn't qualify for loans, shouldn't have qualified for loans. There are certain lenders who qualified people, they shouldn't have qualified for loans. It's a two-way street, no question about it. But the fact is, it's a crisis. It's a crisis for our economy. Housing sales is it's the biggest engine, or one of the biggest engines that drives our economy. When housing sales are slow, it's very bad in general. People lose jobs, and it has a societal impact when my house is okay, but the houses on either side of me and on either side of those are foreclosed upon. It reduces the value of my house. And if we have entire neighborhoods where the foreclosure rate is very high, it completely destroys the housing stock basically in those communities. So it really is necessary to find a solution to this crisis which doesn't create a huge homeless population, which wouldn't be good for our economy, and which takes a measured, balanced approach and a sensible approach to keeping people in their homes whenever possible. But when it's not possible, sometimes it's not possible. And those people will have to move on to some other living arrangement. But for the most part, simply saying, let's flush everything out, you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Now, what's the long-term success rate, though, of the people who stay, like even the 50% who stay in their homes after mediation? How long do they stay? And is the process that you're going through, does that really forestall an inevitability at the end, or does it really change things?
Well, the program started in April, this particular aspect of the program, so I don't know that we can, at this juncture, measure long-term or intermediate-term outcomes, as your question asked. But I can say this, we do get feedback from the people in terms of the value of the service to them. We send out client questionnaires and say to these clients, has this service been helpful to you? From their perspective, it has been very helpful, even though it's brief service. We ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, how valuable was this to you and how happy you were with the service. And we get like 8 out of 10 tens. Of all the people we ask, the vast majority, 80% or better, give us a 10. The last several batches of responses that I've looked at, there were none below 5. So all the people were very happy, relieved, and felt that this was a very valuable service to them. But of course, that value in the long term, we'll have to see as time goes on.
Well, what do you find, Chris? You deal with the people who are coming in who are distraught and who are trying to right their lives. I mean, what's your personal experience with the people you've worked with?
Well, I don't get to have much follow-up with these people. We provide 3 branches of service. We provide an information line where people can call in and make an appointment if they've seen a housing counselor off-site. We provide an advice desk on the 28th floor of the Daly Center, which is where all the foreclosure courtrooms are located, and then we provide the sit-down consultations. And I sometimes get follow-up seeing people on the 28th floor, for example. And it's interesting to see people as they go through this process, because you can see, oh, mediation motion was granted, or the different things that we do for them. Some of them work out, some of them don't.
Well, so speaking of some work out and some don't, for someone who's facing foreclosure now and might be watching this show, what should they do to prepare themselves to get the best possible outcome from this process?
Communicate with as many different branches as they can, housing counselors and with the bank, whatever they have energy for at that point in time, because I see a lot of people getting through this if they follow up in as many different avenues as they can. As terrifying as it might be, they might want to, depending on their financial situation, they might want to list their property for sale, because if it turns out that they won't be able to afford this property, that keeps their options open for doing something besides just being foreclosed on.
Even if it ends up being what they call a short sale, where you sell it for less than you owe.
Or a deed in lieu of foreclosure where they just give the property back to the bank. It's still easier on their credit report or on their credit score, and it gives them some autonomy over the process. I think a lot of people feel helpless as they go through this.
Well, speaking of helpless and speaking of selling the houses that are underwater, Ed, is it common that people who are foreclosed on still owe the remainder of the loan, even if the bank sells it for less than the loan. There's still some that the foreclosed homeowner could still be liable for, correct?
By law, well, I shouldn't say by law, by agreement, in most mortgages, there's a clause that says that they are responsible for any deficiency if the property should sell for less than the amount owed.
But that's part of the foreclosure agreement.
It's part
right?
it's part of the mortgage agreement.
Okay.
And most of the time, lenders do not seek a deficiency. And the logic behind that is quite simple. If one can't pay their mortgage and doesn't have enough money to do that, the chances of a lender actually collecting any
Later,
deficiency are
right.
a little weak, and plus the people have moved or gone somewhere else if they're out of the house. So lenders almost never seek the deficiency. However, occasionally there's a surplus. When property is foreclosed upon, it has to be sold at public sale. And if it does get sold, although our economy is not such to generate surpluses now, but in prior years, surplus was generated. And that surplus remains with the clerk of the court until claimed by one of the owner, somebody who has a right to claim it, usually the owner of the premises.
Wouldn't it, at that point, it would be the bank, because the bank would have taken
Not if it's a surplus. In other words, let's say I owe $100,000 and the house sells for $130,000. That $30,000 is a surplus, so
and
that doesn't go to the bank. That goes back to
you,
the owner.
even though the house was foreclosed on.
Right, or at least it should, but people have to go through a legal process to claim that. You
get
have
it
to
back.
make a petition to get that surplus. Many people are unaware that they have a surplus.
Well, if you have a surplus, I would think you're less likely to end up in foreclosure, but it may not be true
These
It
days,
happens.
these days, because I think I heard a statistic recently where 38% of houses are now underwater, in the sense that people owe more than their house is actually worth.
Scary thought, isn't
It's
it? So, Chris, as people get ready, what's probably the single most important thing someone could do internally to prepare themselves?
Remember to breathe. The calmer they are, the easier the time they'll have working with other people, and the more open they'll be to the directions that they're going to need. I'm sorry. They just need to, take a deep breath and do what's out. Go through the services that are out there, the ones that are available to them. And if they are able to reach those services, and if they are willing to take the time, because it takes time and effort to go through those services, then they're really in the top percentile. Many cases, and I think I have an old statistic when I'm saying this, but I believe it's 80 to 90% of defendants in foreclosure cases don't ever come to court.
80 to 90%.
It used to be that up until our program, because part of the program, and I say ours, there's there are a number of stakeholders, but one of the things that the Chicago Bar Foundation, who's a prime mover in this, and the courts and the Chicago Community Trust did, they helped to get some outreach done. And it's what Chris's statistics is exactly right. There was something like 80 to 90% of the people never bothered to show up. And when I say bothered, not like they blew it off, but they
just didn't,
terrified or hid their
couldn't
head
do
in the
it.
sand, couldn't do it, whatever. I think the statistics
is required to provide